Yesterday, we had the CPI numbers come out, 7.5% increase, the highest since 1982. And it started with food, it started with furnitures, cars, rentals, shelter. Everything went up like crazy. In fact, car rentals up 29%, furniture 17%, regular new cars 12%. I mean, that's just the beginning. In this video, I'm going to cover everything you need to know about inflation, interest rate hikes, and the stock market, where we are, where we headed, pretty much everything you wanted to ask about inflation, supply chains, and what's going to happen with the stock market. But we're just too afraid to ask. Let's go. The real question I want to answer in this video is, what are we doing with this? What's the solution? Where are we headed? What's going to happen with the stock market? So if you ask Kathy Wood, she's going to tell you there's going to be deflation in this market. And that deflation is basically going to push down inflationary pressures all the way back to normal, whatever that is. Well, the problem with this theory that is 100% correct, but I don't think people understand the timing on this. I completely agree with her that new and disruptive technologies are going to cannibalize old, outdated technologies and going to replace them, creating deflationary impact. For example, instead of a factory that employs 100 people, we're going to have a robot that's going to do the same job with 2 people operating the robot. So that's going to be deflationary. Now, there's a lot of different examples of how to explain deflation, and the example I just used is probably not the best one, but that was just exaggeration just to show you what she means. The problem with this is that isn't going to happen tomorrow, not even this year, probably not even next year. When you have deflationary pressures by disruptive technology, that kind of thing takes years and years to materialize. And by the time that happens, we're going to be in some deep doo-doo because the numbers simply does not allow us to wait that long. So I think that even though she's right 100%, I think people misinterpret the problem of what she's suggesting. She's basically saying, well, we're going to be okay in 3 to 4 years because my technology companies are going to change the world. And I'm sure to an extent they are. But honestly, I don't think we have 3 to 4 years to wait because we're in some dire straits right now. On the one hand, we had the government basically bailing out everybody by pouring a lot of money into the system when the pandemic started, which seemed like a good idea. On the other hand, we have major supply chain shortages because of COVID and because now people don't really want to do low-wage jobs. There's better alternatives. So no truck drivers, no hospitality workers, no production workers in factories. Everything is just congested. It's a big, big problem. So on the one hand, we have this massive amount of money, $5.5 trillion pumped into the system just in the last 18 months. So that money, if you combine it with 0% interest, which is what we have for the past 2 years, creates a lack of incentive for people to save. Why would you put your money in a savings account when you're getting 0 rate or basically something close to it? You're going to spend it. So there's a lot of spending, a lot of competition for goods and services. However, at the same time, there's less and less of goods and services because of supply chain logistics and basically lack of workforce. So you have this crazy demand and supply chain logistics shortages. So what happens when you have a lot of demand but not enough supply? Prices skyrocket. This is exactly what we're seeing in the market right now. So basically, if you assume that the Kathy Wood solution is not applicable right now, you really have 3 solutions you can rely on. The first solution would be basically doing nothing, waiting for the God fairy to come, sprinkle her dust, and magically, poof, make inflation go away. That was pretty much the approach of the Fed up until November, actually. They basically told us, hey, don't look up. There's no inflation. It's transitory. Well, that faded away quite quickly, and I feel bad for Jim Cramer, who predicted it Team Transitory when literally days before Team Transitory called it quits.
The weight of the evidence is finally going Pal's way. Team Transitory is going to win.
Several days later.
How long does inflation have to run above your target before the Fed decides maybe it's not so transitory?
Well, I think it's probably a good time to retire that word and try to explain more clearly what we mean.
So in November, the Fed actually had to face reality. And the reality is that if we keep saying, hey, nothing is happening, everything is fine, do not look up, basically we're going to end up with Americans watching their money becoming toilet paper and essentially crushing the economy. They can't afford that to happen. So in November, they basically said, well, we can't do it anymore. So in November, the Fed basically said, well, option one is not that applicable. Surprise, surprise. So that leaves us with two other options, and none of them are really good. Option number two would be to increase rates to where they have to be to completely annihilate inflation. That means aggressive interest rate hikes, much like we had in the 80s with Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan. Now, that kind of thing is not going to be easy to pull off in this debt structure that we have in the US. You see, the US now owes more money than ever before. In fact, our current US national debt is 100% of our GDP. If you increase interest rates, basically you increase the payments that we, the United States, pay for our own debt to service the debt. In fact, the numbers are quite staggering. It's $270 billion per every 1% of rate increase. So if the Fed increases rates too high, we simply can't afford to pay back these loans. And basically that would mean we'll have to print much more money to service these loans, pumping more money into the system, creating even more inflationary pressures, essentially flooding the market with more money. That's not good. Now, the third solution is kind of interesting. The third solution is where I think the Fed is headed right now, is basically increase rates ever so slightly, just enough to slow down inflation a little bit, but not to crash the US under the weight of its own debt. According to option three, basically what we're going to have is a slow, very mild increase in interest rates, just enough to keep inflation moving slower, just to slow it down a little bit. We're not trying to beat it, just trying to slow it down a little bit. Now, that kind of small interest rate hikes are not going to crush us under the weight of our own debt. We can handle that. The problem is that in this approach, what's happening here is we're lying to ourselves. We're creating a slower collapse, but the end result will still be a collapse. The only difference is that while this is going on, we can enjoy and just pretend it doesn't happen. We can completely do not look up. And unfortunately, this kind of scenario, we're going to have a lot of money into the system pumped. We're going to have zero intervention by the Fed, basically just raising interest rates ever so slightly just to keep it going. But the end result is going to be a complete collapse because at some point, the amount of inflation is going to catch up to us and we'll have to admit that instead of doing a root canal, we're now going to have to go into surgery and pull out 5 teeth. So now we have the Fed trying to decide which options they need to take. Option 2, aggressive interest rate hikes, or option 3, basically slight interest rate hikes, hoping for the best and trying to buy us some more time. Well, if they choose option 2, that can only happen if you have cooperation from the government, because in that option, the price of debt is going to be insane unless you do either of two things. You either create massive GDP growth to create more tax revenue to pay for this, or the second option would be if you completely restructure your national debt. However, I'm not sure we have time for that, nor am I sure they can actually get it done. Increasing GDP growth so fast is not that easy. It would require a lot of aggressive bets, like lowering tax rates, deregulation, a lot of things that are politically complex, not sure they can get it done. Fortunately, they do have another option, which they can actually do here, which is restructuring the US debt. Instead of going for the cheap variable interest that we have right now with the short-term debt, let's put everything on the 30-year. Let's restructure the bulk of the debt and send it to the 30-year fixed rates. Those are more expensive, but they're completely fixed, thereby disconnecting the dependency or the connection or the correlation or the fear of interest rate hikes impacting the cost of the US debt. Now, this move is probably going to cost the government anywhere from $300 to $400 billion, but that's going to be the end of it. And it's going to basically unshackle the Fed to do what they want. Unfortunately, and here's the problem, the government has shown no signs of either of these options actually happening. In fact, so far, they've been sitting on their ass doing diddly squat. So that makes me understand that they're not going to do that anytime soon. That leaves us with option 3. And option 3 isn't that great because under option 3, what we're basically going to have is slow to mild interest rate hikes just to slow down inflation, not to win the battle, just to slow them down a little bit, hoping for the best. Essentially, this is just a slower complete collapse of everything. However, this is going to be much worse because instead of going for a root canal, which we need right now, by the time this party comes to a screeching halt, we're going to need surgery and like 5 teeth removed. So the crash is going to be slower, but the end result is going to be much, much worse. And unfortunately, because politicians are so short-sighted, they can take this choice without blinking twice. Basically buying themselves 6, 7, 8 months of peace and quiet, money in the system, stock market completely relaxed, economy is stable, low interest, everybody's happy. Then we figured out the plan, 8 months, who knows what will be in 8 months? Aliens can take over. I mean, we don't know. That's how politicians think. Unfortunately, that's going to be a horrible result for the US economy and the stock market. But in the meanwhile, it's going to be a party like none other. You see, the Fed is actually encouraged by the fact that the 10-year bond is now at 2%. In a year, it went from 1.1 to 2%. It's basically pushing higher. And when you have that, that actually serves as a coolant to the market, no doubt. It actually does the Fed's job for them. And they're kind of hoping secretly like this is going to solve the problem. It isn't. It's too little, too late. It's like an aspirin for a gunshot. It's not going to help. But it makes it seem as if we're headed in the right direction. The problem is, and I'm not going to get into this in this video, at this point, we're actually headed to an inverse curve, God forbid, but let's see what happens with that. That's a whole different discussion. The problem with the solution that seems to be happening right now is that the fall from grace with option, basically, hey, let's wait and see, is going to be much, much worse than people understand. And the brunt of it is going to be felt by the poorest people. The lowest income households are going to be the ones hurt the most by this option, because when food prices go up, when shelter prices go up, people with low income will feel the pain much harder than people with mansions and airlines. It's pretty much the way it is. So you have this massive tax about to be levied on the poor just in the name of prolonging this party we have right now and not facing the real problem. That's a shame. And unfortunately, what happened yesterday just reconfirms what I'm thinking about the next steps. It seems like this latest development from yesterday is just another nail in that coffin, basically creating a bull run based on the Fed's inability or lack of desire to act, only then to be stopped by a screeching halt of interest rates pushing the market down. So what happened yesterday? So we had the CPI go up 7.5%, the highest since 1982. And unfortunately, that little development is going to expose the Fed. It's going to expose the bluff, because the Fed, in a sense, is like a bouncer at a nightclub. That bouncer needs to look big and menacing so he doesn't get into fights. As a bouncer, you never want to fight, right? You just want people to be so afraid of you. So just the right look or the growl basically calms people down. If people lose fear from the bouncer, then basically the bouncer has to fight every freaking night. And that's a job no bouncer ever wants to do. You get injured. I mean, it's painful. You get sued. I mean, if you lose your deterrent force, if you lose the image, if you lose people's credibility, then you're not really a good bouncer. Most good bouncers never even fight, even once. And that's exactly what's happening with the Fed here. People will see that the 7.5% is not going to cause any meaningful reaction from the Fed. They'll probably call an emergency meeting. They'll probably announce a hike of, 0.5%, 0.75%, maybe even 1%. It probably will happen around March, maybe even sooner. But that's just nothing compared to a 7.5% CPI. And when that happens, I believe this is going to be the beginning of that bull run I was talking about, because it's going to expose the fact that the Fed, even with 7.5% inflation, can't really do nothing beyond give you 1% of interest. And when people understand that, that's going to be the trigger for that run that I was actually talking about. Now, yesterday, we saw the beginning of that, and we saw how the Fed actually shut it down. We had the 7.5% inflation come out. The market was all green like crazy because people were basically saying, well, the Fed ain't going to do nothing about it. And then the Fed actually sent James Bullard from St. Louis to basically do an interview and say, hey, we're raising interest. You better be careful. That actually did crash the market a little bit and basically cooled it down. But they had to pull out the heavy guns. They had to send out James Bullard and throw him under the bus basically to cool things down. So that just shows you how eroded the fear from the Fed interest rate hikes is. So in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, do your own research. This is just my crazy theory, not a financial advisor. Definitely do not copy what I plan to do. It's just my crazy theory, and it's definitely not conventional or conservative. So what I see for the next 6 to 7 to 8 months depends on how long it takes for the Fed to actually understand. They have no choice but to raise more aggressively, is a crazy bull run. Now, what do I do about this? Well, 70% of my portfolio stays put. I'm not touching it because that's a 5 to 10 year portfolio. In the 5 to 10 year span, this inflationary year isn't going to mean anything. I'm in fact with Kathy Wood on this. 5 to 10 years, this is going to go away. I don't care. These are my long-term investors. 70% of my money stays put, not even touching it. I do have 30% of my entire portfolio in cash that was set aside waiting for the Fed to say, hey, interest rate hikes, the market goes down, then we buy for cheap. Now, I believe that this thing has been postponed now with the Fed lack of ability and lack of desire to do anything about it, and them basically admitting they're going to kick the can down the road for another 6 to 7, 8 months. I believe that this money can serve me better in the market. So I'm going to put it in the market. Probably majority of it will go to the S&P 500, not even individual stocks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the market for the next few months just to let it enjoy this bull run, which I think will happen. And then it's going to go back to cash waiting for that crash. I believe that crash I was talking about will happen, but it will happen much later after the Fed is forced to announce aggressive rate hikes. Now, this is just my crazy theory. The thing is, and I got to be honest with you, nobody really knows what's next for the stock market. I don't know either. It's just a bet. You want to call it a gamble? Call it a gamble. You want to call it a bet? Call it a bet. But nobody really knows. Nobody can predict the future. Definitely not the stock market. The stock market is like a drunken man. And if you want to predict where the next step of that drunken man will be by an algorithm, it's going to be mission impossible. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing an educated guess about where I think the market is headed on 30% of my money. But at the end of the day, I don't really know. And this might be just a complete set of nonsense, gobbledygook bullshit, and might be completely wrong. So I don't suggest you do what I do. I'm just sharing my crazy ideas because I think it's thought-provoking, and I want you guys to do your own research. And, let me know below if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you hate me, if you like me, do what you do. Let me know below. A huge shout out for the channel members, the patrons. If you want to become part of our private Patreon group, the link is going to be below in the description section. It's $5 per month. We don't have any courses or anything like that. That's the only thing that supports the channel beyond ads. If you want to support the channel, you're more than welcome. If not, just watch the free videos. It's cool. See you next time.